Salams from the People's Dispatch studios in New Delhi. I'm Siddhantani and you're watching Daily Debrief. On the show today, we examine America's decision to seize the Afghan central bank's funds, Facebook's record stock price slump, and the Beijing Winter Games. First up, United States President Joe Biden has signed an executive order that effectively seizes the Afghan central bank's funds in the United States, over $7 billion of them, and then allocates half of it to humanitarian aid to the struggling country, while potentially making the other half accessible to September 11 victims who have filed lawsuits against the Taliban in the United States. The order was issued on Friday, and the money, like we said, belongs to Da Afghanistan Bank. The decision to do this has drawn severe rebuke. Prabir, how do we make sense of the richest country in the world doing this to a nation that is very low on the Human Development Index and facing a burgeoning humanitarian crisis on multiple fronts?
It's interesting that the US has seized funds, of course, as you said, from one of the poorest countries in the world, because the money was basically within the United States. That's also because dollar is the default international currency. Therefore, if they have to get things from other countries, they need an access to dollar accounts. Therefore, the money was essentially parked in the United States, held in the United States. Now, this raises the issue that if this is what's going to happen, if we consider dollar to be the international currency, then how do countries look at this? So it's not just a question of Afghanistan alone. Yeah. In this particular case, as you've rightly said, this is one of the poorest countries in the world trying to recover out of a war. And also, as we now know, 80% of its population are very close to the hunger level, if not more. Yeah. And it needs desperately food, grains, other supplies, oil, gas, etc. to run its basic functions of a state. So in this case, taking away their foreign exchange effectively is a huge blow to Afghanistan, and what is going to be given back to them is going to be given back to them as if it's the largest to be given by United States. As you've said, half of it has now been taken over to provide aid back to Afghanistan, so, and that will be done by United States under its control. Yeah. So even there, it's not the independent act of a country like Afghanistan, but their money is going to come back as if it's a gift being given by the United States for activities which the United States will dictate and whom the United States will pay from, of course, Afghanistan's money. Yeah. The second part of it is, which what makes it even more outrageous, is the fact that it's for 9/11 victims, September 11 victims. And as you know, in the list of people who had attacked or who were in the aircraft which was used in the 9/11 attacks, none of them are Afghans. Yeah. There is no Taliban fingerprint that can be shown. The question was that Bin Laden was there in Afghanistan. And at that time, Afghanistan had said, you show us evidence that he was involved, we'll hand him over to you. Even that, to that extent, they are willing to play with the United States when the United States decided to really invade Afghanistan. So this is unilateral judgment being given by President Biden that the Taliban was guilty of 9/11 and therefore it's Afghanistan's treasury being raided or looted by the United States to pay the victims is okay. Now that apart from the fact that, as you have said, the richest country in the world, looting the reserves of the poorest country in the world, the legal precedent here is also extremely dangerous because it means that any money that is in the United States is fair game under any legal pretext. And we have also the case of Iran, about 100 to 120 billion frozen assets that are there, for 120 billion, $100 billion frozen assets. And Iran has been fighting this case, again using the 9/11 as a pretext. A case has been filed, and I think something like $7.5 billion plus something else was judgment given by a US court. So these are the kind of problems that is there. It flows out of the fact that the US has actually changed its laws to allow for this to happen. Otherwise, sovereign countries cannot be sued, was the basic principle on which international law was based.
Yeah. So I was going to say then, other than sort of further example of the US undermining established international law principles and precedents and operating with complete immunity, how else should the rest of the world be viewing this?
Well, the US, as I said, this particular law they passed says essentially that sovereign states can be sued in a domestic court in the United States. Iran is willing to defend itself, for instance, in an international court.
Yeah.
But the issue is a domestic court. And therefore, if you accept that US domestic courts has sovereignty across the world, this is what it really means. That means, can I pass a judgment against the United States in an Indian court and seize the property of the US embassy in Delhi?
India.
This is really the issue, because a lot of the Iranian assets are really this. A building which was owned by Iran was taken over, and that's now worth $800 million to $1 billion. So these are the kind of issues that we get if we allow countries to be sued domestically, and if that country cannot defend itself in that court, then of course whatever judgment it passes, then it can be used to seize assets of that country in the United States. This only exception to international law is the United States. Nobody else has done this. And now this of course opens a Pandora's box. Can other countries also do it? But the reality is this happens because US is still the financial hegemon. It may no longer be politically the hegemon of the world, but it is still financially the hegemon, because dollar is the reserve currency of the world. So we have to think what it means for the international order if domestic courts can pass judgments. Iran didn't even defend this in the US domestic court, because he said, you don't have the right to do this against us. And that is the established international law. In fact, using this, the victims of 9/11 who had sued Iran tried to get this from also a European country. I think they sued it at Luxembourg. They tried to sue them there and said, give us the money. And they said this is not possible. This is not that doesn't really possible under international law. So the issue really is complete unilateralism of the US president, in this case Joe Biden, but also its legal system, which seems to believe that US law is supreme and all other laws have to subordinate to US law, including of course international law. And what do we do with international currency being dollar? I think that is the crucial issue that we have to address.
Yeah. And all the while then also we'll forget to consider this 80% of Afghans living at or below the poverty line as also victims of 9/11. Particularly if there's no evidence to show any Afghan involvement in those attacks on the World Trade Center.
And as you know, Saudi Arabia's major involvement, most of the citizens, most of the people who were involved were Saudi citizens. And there has been tacit cooperation, it appears, at some levels of the Saudi government in this. Yes, not that the Saudi government was directly involved, but there does seem to be some involvement, and that's been raised time and again. But of course, Saudi Arabia has heft because it has the oil, and therefore the United States is not willing to really go against Saudi Arabia. But poor Afghans, of course, are being held to ransom, and their resources are being looted. Is a sad commentary on what's happening in the world today.
Right. Thanks very much, Prabir, for that. Facebook's owner Meta Platforms saw its stock fall by a record value, a slump of more than $230 billion in a single day of trading this past week. It is the record daily loss for a US firm. The share price fell by over 26% after quarterly figures disappointed investors. Meta also said that Facebook's daily active users had dropped for the first time in its 18-year history. According to the Bloomberg Billionaires Index, the share price slide saw Chief Executive Mark Zuckerberg's net worth fall by a whopping $31 billion. The drop in Zuckerberg's personal fortune was more than the annual gross domestic product of nations such as Iceland, Uganda and Zambia. Prashant joins us now to talk about what has become our favorite social media platform. What do we make of these market numbers, Prashant, in a social context?
Right, Siddhant. So the issue fundamentally is that Facebook is under siege, and it's under siege in a unique way, not only because regulators are targeting it, but also because its fundamental, the basis on which it is organized is itself under attack. The fact that people, it was a particular social media phenomenon of a particular time. And now there's a very good argument to be made that that time has passed. And therefore, Facebook is no longer that attractive a proposition. And we know that Facebook depends on ads for revenue. And if it depends on ads for revenue, it means it needs to have that kind of user base. Right? So it has to have a continuously large user base. And Facebook, unlike, say, to some extent like Google, but say unlike Amazon or Microsoft, is one of those companies which is massively, almost entirely dependent on ads for its revenues.
Yeah.
So what we see is that once your new user, say, influx starts declining or stabilizing, what happens is that it'll slowly stop becoming an attractive option for advertisers who might go for competitors. For instance, we know that TikTok has become one of the most popular platforms across the world, and Facebook Facebook or Instagram introduced Reels and tries really presenting it as its main competitor, so to speak, but it's not really still reached there yet. Whether it'll reach there is a different question. So on the other hand, there are of course regulatory issues across the world, in the United States, in Europe, in various other countries. Facebook is under a scanner for its practices on hate speech, for its monopolistic practices. So there are multiple attacks that are taking place, very well-deserved attacks. When you say attacks, it's not like they're being unfairly criticized. All this is because of Facebook's policies, which have purely driven, which have been purely based on viewership and virality, rather than any social thinking in terms of how an organization like this should exist in today's world. So, the flaws of all that thinking of the early 2000s, where they saw themselves as just, they thought they were beyond and above all kinds of political issues, all kinds of ethical and social issues. And they were just like, we are just here to connect people.
All kinds of legal and economic issues.
Exactly. And so the flaws of that kind of thinking, which is so deeply ingrained in Facebook, are now being seen in all this kind of regulatory action. On the other hand, like I said, the market is changing as well. People's preferences are changing as well. And that is what is bringing Facebook to a halt. So yeah, it's a fascinating phenomenon because it actually shows how society is changing, how markets are changing, interesting things.
Yeah. You mentioned the other fronts on which Facebook is fighting battles. There's a bit of a to and fro going on with the European Union. What's happening there?
Right. So this has to do with the data transfer agreement between Europe and the United States, which came into effect after the Snowden revelations, and that expired, and that was struck down rather. And so now there is no such principle as such. So Facebook is now, they released this whole thing where they sort of gave an indication that they would leave Meta, probably using it as they would leave Europe, probably using it as some kind of bargaining tool. And we saw some European leaders say that, well, we are fine without Facebook. So that, of course, I don't think seriously there is any plan of that. But again, it's an indication of what we said, the fact that globally at various levels, there's a mass dissatisfaction with how this company has functioned as a legal, political and financial entity.
Yeah.
And that is actually being reflected in this, fierce anger, I think, which is not only a political or a regulatory thing, but also at a social level, people are very unhappy with Facebook. So Facebook's solution seems to be to look at what is called the metaverse, which is some kind of a long-term plan. No, it's not a profit-making plan, at least now. It's this notion that somewhere in the future, so much of our activity will be virtual, that there'll be entire worlds which are virtual. That's no other way to describe it. And Facebook hopes to sort of be an early player in that market. Now that's a big gamble because we really don't know if that's going to work out. There are a lot of people who say that this is just a damn squib. So short term to medium term, I don't see any major strategies ahead for Facebook to actually deal with this mass dissatisfaction at every level of society with the way the company has functioned. It's probably very accurate to say that they're deserving it. It's very well deserved as far as it is concerned, because all these years they operated as though they were above not only the law but the concerns of society. Any kind of criticism that was raised, they were just happy to give a very tokenistic response, or ignore it at all, ignore it completely. They've sided with some very, very dangerous and problematic forces across the world. The way their algorithms have functioned have enabled hate speech. They've enabled some very, very bad forms of social behavior. And I think
influenced elections.
Exactly. All of this is coming back to strike at them. So of course, one of the unfortunate things that has happened is that irrespective of what Facebook's fortunes are, many of these have actually become normalized, because Facebook also contributed to establishing a market or a social or a cultural sphere where all of this was actually normalized. So it's not just Facebook, it's big tech as a whole. That's very problematic. But keeping some of those larger philosophical issues aside, for Facebook itself, tough to, I think, overcome many of these challenges. The metaverse is not really an ideal solution. So I think I would actually agree with the European leaders who are who have said that we are quite fine without Facebook as well.
Without Facebook.
And the key question is that the alternatives that are emerging, the new forms of technology that are emerging, are they also, will we make the same mistake again in terms of not thinking about them in terms of not regulating them in the right kind of manner, where there is enough space given to free speech, of course, which is very important, where there's enough space given to building communities, which is very good, versus, say, the kind of interventions that are needed to ensure that majoritarianism, hate, and inflammatory content is not allowed to just circulate. Fake news, for instance, is not allowed to just circulate like that. So that, I think, is a big question for the future as well.
Right. Maybe the way forward is to look at their own policies and programming and then figure out what the world needs after that.
Right.
I'll ask you to stick around for the next story as well, Prashant. The Winter Olympics, the 2022 Winter Olympic Games are nearly halfway through in Beijing. And so far, the action from the first city to host both the summer and the winter games has been fairly spectacular. In fact, just before getting into studio, I had a text from my mother telling me to watch the figure skating, which she described, I suppose, for the purposes of brevity as poetry in motion. But this time, more than ever before, in my 2 decades of covering sport, the mainstream media seems particularly charged up about talking politics. We've read, particularly in the Western press, and no doubt inspired by the so-called diplomatic boycott of the games, very cleverly concocted by their masters, stories of burner phones, exhortations to athletes to speak out on issues, and even questions about why Beijing got the games in the first place, when as many as 6 European nations also bid for the games. Several of these voices now championing human rights don't bat an eyelid when, for example, women are not paid more than a small fraction of the men playing the same sport. Or for that matter, when the US decides to take money belonging to one of the poorest nations in the world. Prashant, where do we begin?
Yeah, good question. This is a bit out of my league on this. But just as somebody who has been reading the news, I think the story of Eileen Gu is very instructive of what has been happening. And because, she's a mixed US-Chinese sports person and athlete, just 18 years old, in the freestyle skiing, discipline, and she's won a gold medal already. And it's a remarkable, very inspiring performance, actually. Also because she chose to compete for China, where her mother's from. And throughout her career, which is, like I said, she's just 18. Throughout her career, she's sort of highlighted the fact of sport being this uniting factor, the possibility of, conversations being held, of cultural exchange happening through sport. And the amount of hate she's received is quite is remarkable. It's scary, actually, because you have, there's been a hashtag calling her a traitor because she decided to compete for China. As opposed to United States. There is there have been all kinds of accusations thrown against her, all kinds of questions raised about her. Even objective media coverage, for instance, has really focused on, has not focused on the positive message she has chosen to talk about.
Yeah, consistently.
As much as tried to make it as controversial as possible. So, I think her case is actually a microcosm of what has been the larger approach towards China, for instance, towards the Olympic Games, for instance. There's been, like you said, a lot of issues. I think there was a very good example of the artificial snow that is used in many of these games. There was a big question of sustainability, whereas exactly a few years ago, when exactly the same technology was used, it was hailed as a great thing. So, so time and again you see that the double standards in many of these games, many of these issues is remarkable and startling, and that's actually the important thing, because no one is saying that there are no questions when it comes to the Olympics, for instance. So sport, because it's always a controversial field, right? So it's always there. But the double standards are really what are alarming at this point of time, because any kind of coverage seems to always point, ultimately bring it into some kind of controversial or negative aspect, whereas the same coverage, when you look at, say, another country hosting it, is much, much different. So I think that's one of the more unfortunate bits of this round of the Winter Olympics. It has actually taken away a lot from the sport. And like you said, the diplomatic boycott really sort of definitely set it all in motion.
Perhaps this will put to bed the debate once and for all that, unlike what the IOC keeps telling us, sport is politics.
Absolutely, and I think that it's politics in multiple ways, because it's politics not only in the negative sense that, say, the Western media has been covering it. It's also politics in a positive sense that there still remains a possibility, there still always is the possibility of sport as a uniting factor.
Absolutely.
And I think that's very essential to sort of, for both athletes and countries to sort of remember, and that's important, and that's political as well. So I think we should also not see this argument about it being uniting is just a cliche or just a slogan, because it genuinely does have that potential. It has had that potential in the past. Great athletes have actually served that purpose. We've talked about many of these athletes, whether they be footballers, whether it be the World Cup, whether it be the Olympics. We talked about many of these incidents, and that continues. The point, of course, is I think it's a larger question for the media, the political establishment as well, in terms of how do you uncritically accept what, especially for the media, do you uncritically accept what the United States and the Western powers, the kind of narratives they put forth, and do you ask yourself this question as to, are we, is this how we've covered the past? What have we done in the past, right? Whereas what are we doing now? So these are, I think, questions that definitely need to be asked or internally asked as well. And that's, I think, a very important point. And like I said, ultimately, this is all part of what is often called this new Cold War, in terms of how anything around China, or for that matter even Russia, is being continuously framed. You see how every day there is talk of imminent war, and that's like in Ukraine, like even yesterday I think there was imminent war right now. And this war, which for good reason doesn't, it's very good. It's not happening because Russia said it's not interested, at least in those invasions. So I think that's a larger question that we're going to see much more of in the coming years, maybe even in the coming decades, as China rises as a strong competitor to the United States, as a country which has its own relationship with other countries across the world. There's going to be this constant narrative attack of portraying anything and everything to do with China as inherently controversial. So definitely something to watch out for.
Meanwhile, we are just fortunate that we still have a public service broadcaster that's actually showing us those games for free in this country. So we will enjoy the action from Beijing. Thanks very much, Prashant. And that does it for this episode of Daily Debrief from Prashant, myself, and the entire People's Dispatch team. Thank you very much for watching. For more on all these stories, you can visit our website, peoplesdispatch.org, and give us a follow on all the regular social media platforms for updates. We'll be back next week with more. Till then, stay safe. Goodbye.